For most of the 20th century, the Italian Mafia decided who was allowed to run a criminal enterprise in America, not who was allowed to succeed at one, who was allowed to have one at all. And if you were black, running numbers in Harlem or policy in Chicago, you had three options, and everybody in the business understood exactly what they were. Refuse them and they kill you. Work for them and you'd better be the most useful weapon they've ever held. Or cut them out entirely, build a supply line that answers to nobody, and pray they never work out how you did it. One of them was a woman from the Caribbean who ran Harlem's numbers banks before any man on this list went to war with the Mafia's own enforcer and never once agreed to hand over a dollar. One of them cut a deal with Lucky Luciano's commission and ran his territory for the next 30 years, not as their employee, not as their rival, but as something closer to a governor operating under a larger empire's flag. One of them made Chicago so uncomfortable that Al Capone's organization decided the cost of removing him was higher than the cost of leaving him alone. And one of them was so effective at killing that the Italian mob put him on retainer, a man whose intelligence frightened his employers almost as much as his work did. Four people. Four completely different answers to the same impossible question. Every case here is built from court records, contemporaneous reporting, and published biography, not street legend, and where the record is thin, I'll say so. This is Bloody Reports. We start at the beginning with the woman who taught the rest of them how it was done and who found a 19-year-old bodyguard nobody had heard of yet. In the early 1930s, a woman in Harlem did something that no one in the American underworld did, before or since. She took out paid advertisements in the newspapers, not to sell anything, to attack the New York Police Department by name, to tell Harlem which officers were taking money, what they were taking it for, and what they were doing to people who couldn't pay it. She was a black woman, an immigrant running an illegal numbers bank, and she used her own money to buy column inches in newspapers to accuse the Department of Corruption in print under her own name. They arrested her for it. She went to prison. She came out and did it again. When Dutch Schultz, the most feared gangster in New York, a man with City Hall in his pocket, decided Harlem's numbers game belonged to him, every other operator in that neighborhood folded within months. She didn't fold. She went to war with him for years, and she was still standing when he was shot dead in a New Jersey chop house in 1935. Her name was Stephanie St. Clair. Harlem called her Madam Queen. And the man who did most of her fighting was a 19-year-old she picked up off the street, a kid with a scarred head who would later be known to the entire world as the Godfather of Harlem. Before Bumpy Johnson was anybody, he was her soldier. This is the story the films about him never tell. Almost everything about her early life is contested, and I'm going to tell you that up front rather than pick the tidiest version. She said she was born in Martinique, a French Caribbean island, around 1897. Some records and researchers point to Guadeloupe instead and to an earlier birth year, possibly 1886. That discrepancy is real and unresolved in the published research, so I'm giving you both rather than picking whichever sounds better on camera. What is consistent across every account is that she arrived in New York in the 1910s, alone, young, French-speaking, with almost nothing. Understand what that meant. She was black, foreign, female, and poor in a city that had a specific low ceiling for each of those four things separately. Combined, the ceiling was the floor. She did not speak English on arrival. She spoke French, and she spoke it well, educated French, not patois, and for the rest of her life, people who met her commented on how she carried herself. She was not from Harlem, and she never pretended to be. That distance was part of her authority. By the early 1920s, she had saved money. Accounts differ on how much, with $10,000 the most frequently repeated figure, though it isn't independently verified. She put it into the one business in Harlem that a person with capital and no access to a bank could actually enter: the numbers. Before the numbers business, there was survival work, the kind every immigrant woman without documentation options moved through in that era. Domestic work, informal work, small hustles, most of which official history simply didn't bother recording, because young black immigrant women funneling through New York like her were not considered worth a paper trail. What we do know is that whatever she did before the early 1920s, she came out of it with enough saved capital to become an owner rather than an employee, a distinction almost nobody else in her position managed. And she did not enter the numbers business quietly. From the start, accounts describe her running her own operation rather than working her way up inside somebody else's, an unusual path in a business almost entirely controlled, at the street level, by men. She is frequently described in later reporting as one of perhaps 6 women who ran a numbers bank of any real size in Harlem during this period, and by some accounts, the only one who ran hers without a male partner listed above her. It's worth pausing on why Harlem specifically became the center of this economy rather than any other black neighborhood in the country. The Great Migration had brought hundreds of thousands of black Americans north through the 1910s and 20s, and Harlem absorbed a huge share of them into a compressed geographic area with genuinely limited formal economic options. That combination of dense population, blocked access to legitimate credit, and a built-in daily habit of small wagers most working people could afford is part of what made the numbers game scale the way it did nowhere else. The numbers game, known as policy, worked like this. You picked 3 digits. You gave a nickel, a dime, a dollar to a runner on the corner. The winning number came from a published figure nobody could rig, a racetrack total, a financial market number, so anyone in the neighborhood could check it in the paper the next morning. If your digits came up, you were paid 600 to 1. The real odds are 1,000 to 1. That gap is the entire business. And it was not a racket sitting on top of Harlem. It was woven through it. Hundreds of thousands of people played. Domestic workers, porters, nurses, church ushers. During the Depression, it functioned as the neighborhood's savings scheme, lottery and entertainment at once, and, critically, as the only financial institution in Harlem that would take a black person's money and occasionally give some back. Understand what only actually meant in practice. Over 1,000 banks failed across the United States in 1930 alone, and black depositors were disproportionately locked out of the ones that survived, turned away from lending, treated as a liability rather than a customer, in a country where a black-owned bank in Harlem was a rarity rather than a norm. If a building needed a roof, if a funeral needed paying for, if a family wanted their child to have money for school, the Numbers Bank was frequently the only institution in the neighborhood willing to extend credit against a winning number or simply take a dime today on the promise of 600 back tomorrow. That's why the ecosystem around the numbers game was so dense. An operation like St. Clair's needed runners to collect bets block by block, controllers to compile the day's slips into a single ledger before the winning number was published, and enough cash reserve on hand to survive a big payout week without the whole operation folding. It ran, in other words, like an actual financial institution, except every part of it was illegal, which meant every part of it also ran on reputation instead of law. St. Clair became one of its bankers. By the peak of her operation, she is described as employing dozens of runners and comptrollers and taking in very large sums weekly though the exact figures attached to her operation vary enormously between sources, and none of them are audited, so treat any specific number as an estimate rather than a fact. She also ran a particularly tight operation within that ecosystem. Employees who reported to her describe a management style closer to a formal business than an outlaw enterprise, fixed cuts for runners, a clear chain up to the controllers, and consequences for skimming that had nothing to do with menace and everything to do with simply being cut out of the next payday. Sloppy bookkeeping was, in a business with no legal recourse, the fastest way to lose everyone's trust at once, because a shortfall anywhere in the chain meant someone had skimmed a slip and nobody could prove who. Two things about how she ran it matter most. First, she paid. Every account agrees on this. The entire policy business ran on trust, because there was no contract, no regulator, and no court. A banker who didn't pay a winner was finished inside a week. Her reputation for paying is a real part of why she survived competitors who had more muscle than she did. Second, she fought the police, in public, in print. Harlem was not the only city running this kind of economy. Chicago had its own version, Policy Wheels, run largely out of the South Side, operating on nearly identical principles. What set Harlem's version apart, and what made St. Clair's rise possible, was the sheer density of competing bankers working the same few square miles. By some estimates, dozens of individual numbers banks operated in Harlem simultaneously during the late 1920s, each with its own runners, its own reputation, and its own relationship with whichever police precinct covered its blocks. That density meant competition wasn't abstract. Bettors could and did switch banks if a competitor paid faster, paid more reliably, or simply treated runners better. St. Clair's insistence on prompt, accurate payouts wasn't generosity, it was the only sustainable competitive strategy in a market where the product itself, a number and a promise, was identical everywhere you bought it. The only thing that differentiated one banker from another was whether they were still solvent and still honest the next time you wanted to bet. This is also why the business tolerated and even required a level of internal organization that outsiders rarely credited it with. Controllers didn't just tally slips, they cross-checked runner totals against expected volume for a given block, catching both theft and simple error before it could sink the week's payout. A numbers bank that couldn't do this reliably didn't survive a bad week. St. Clair's operation, by the accounts that exist, did. This is the part that makes her unlike anyone else in this channel's back catalog, and I'd argue unlike anyone else in American organized crime, period. Harlem in the 1920s and 30s was policed as an extraction operation. Officers took payments from numbers, bankers as a matter of routine. Bankers who paid were left alone. Bankers who didn't were raided, and their customers were harassed, and their runners were arrested. St. Clair's response was to buy space in Harlem newspapers and publish. What did the advertisements actually say? Accounts describe her naming specific incidents, officers pocketing weekly protection payments, and raids that seemed to target runners who hadn't paid rather than runners caught with real evidence. She used the ads to walk Harlem residents through what to do if they were stopped, what an officer could and couldn't search without a warrant, what a resident had a right to ask an officer to state on the record, and where to report an incident if they believed they'd been shaken down rather than lawfully arrested. This was, in effect, a Know Your Rights campaign, funded and published by a woman who was herself running the exact kind of business the department claimed to be policing. Consider the asymmetry. Contrast her approach with how most bankers in her position handled the same pressure. The standard playbook, then as now, was to treat the weekly payment to police as simply another line item, a cost of doing business paid quietly with the operator's silence as part of the transaction. Bankers who played by that logic tended to survive longer with less public drama, precisely because they never gave the department a reason to make an example of them. St. Clair broke that logic deliberately. One frequently cited incident describes her publicly naming a specific precinct captain in print, accusing him of running an organized collection scheme among numbers operators in his jurisdiction, an accusation serious enough by several accounts to trigger an internal departmental inquiry, though the outcome of that inquiry isn't well documented and may not have resulted in any real discipline. Whether or not it changed anything structurally, it was a level of direct confrontation nobody else in her position was attempting. It's also worth noting the timing. This was the same decade New York's broader political establishment was already under pressure over police corruption more generally, work that eventually fed into the larger Seabury hearings that reshaped city government. St. Clair's public campaign runs alongside that larger reckoning, and she wasn't waiting for reformers to arrive from outside Harlem. She was making the same argument from inside it years earlier with far less protection than any official investigator would have had. The department had a budget, a legal office, uniforms, weapons, and the presumption of legitimacy that comes with a badge. St. Clair had a printing bill and a willingness to put her name on it. There was no upside for her personally in doing this. It didn't protect her business. If anything, it made her a more visible target for exactly the kind of raid she was describing. Retaliation followed quickly by several accounts. Her operation was targeted with unusual frequency in the months after a round of advertisements ran, and at least one of her prison terms is connected in contemporaneous reporting to this period of open conflict with the department, rather than simply to running an illegal lottery. Though the direct causal line between any single ad and any single arrest isn't documented cleanly enough to state as established fact, I'll leave it as a pattern rather than a proven cause. She also gave evidence and information that reporting connects to broader investigations of police corruption in the city. The documentation on which is thinner than the legend suggests, so I'll put it no stronger than that. Her specific role in that period's larger corruption inquiry is frequently overstated online, and there isn't enough of a paper trail to state it as confirmed fact here. It's worth noting what she did not do. She did not go quiet after the first arrest. She did not move her operation further underground, the way most bankers who ran afoul of the department chose to. She went back into print. That pattern repeats across roughly a decade. Publish, get arrested, serve the time, resume the business, publish again. Nobody else running a comparable operation in Harlem during this period used that specific tool. Public, sustained, on-the-record confrontation with the exact institution most capable of shutting them down. Now sit with the position she was in. She was running an illegal business. She was, by any legal standard, a criminal. And she was simultaneously the loudest public critic of police corruption in her own neighborhood, funding that criticism out of the illegal business, under her own name, with no institution behind her and every incentive to stay quiet. If this is the kind of history you want more of, the parts that don't make it into the films, the deals, the refusals, the details that are actually documented versus the ones that just got repeated until they sounded true, subscribe. That's the whole channel. Now, the soldier she found. Somewhere in this period, she found Ellsworth Johnson. He was born in Charleston, South Carolina in 1905, sent north to Harlem as a teenager, and by his late teens, he had a reformatory record and a reputation for a specific quality. He did not back down from anyone, ever, regardless of the arithmetic. The nickname came from an irregularity in the shape of his skull. St. Clair made him her enforcer. Understand the shape of that relationship, because the popular version inverts it. This was not a young gangster taking a woman under his protection. It was an established businesswoman with capital, a network, and a public profile hiring muscle, and the muscle was a kid in his 20s with nothing. She was, by most accounts, roughly 20 years older than him. Several sources describe the relationship as having gone well beyond employer and employee. This is asserted in multiple biographical accounts, including material connected to Johnson's own family, but it isn't documented the way a court record is, so take it as reported rather than confirmed. What is not in dispute is the direction of the education. She taught him the business, the politics of it, the accounting of it, who to pay and who to refuse, and above all, the thing that defined his entire later career: how to negotiate from a position that looks weak. Johnson wasn't the only young man she brought into the organization, but he's the one whose later career made the relationship famous. Several accounts describe her running what amounted to an informal apprenticeship system. Young men from the neighborhood, often with reformatory records that shut every legitimate door, given real responsibility inside her operation if they showed the right combination of discretion and nerve. Most of them never became more than reliable runners or muscle. Johnson is the one who absorbed the parts of the education that mattered most, not the violence, but the negotiation underneath it. There's a detail in several biographical accounts worth sitting with. St. Clair reportedly insisted Johnson learn to read contracts and financial statements, not just collect payments and settle disputes with his fists. Whether that's precisely accurate in its details or a detail that's been smoothed into the legend over decades, the through line holds up against everything that came after. Johnson's later reputation wasn't built on being the most feared man in Harlem. It was built on being the one Italian bosses could sit across a table from and trust to actually understand the terms of a deal. That is not a skill street violence teaches. It's a skill somebody has to actually teach you on purpose. Every single thing Bumpy Johnson is famous for, the composure, the deal-making, the ability to sit across from Italian bosses and be treated as a principal rather than an employee, he learned working for her. Then Dutch Schultz decided he wanted Harlem. Arthur Flegenheimer, Dutch Schultz, was a German-Jewish gangster who had built a bootlegging empire and, as Prohibition ended, needed a new revenue stream. He looked uptown at a numbers economy turning over enormous sums in small bills, run by Black and Caribbean operators with no political protection, and he moved. Most Harlem bankers folded. That was the rational choice. Schultz had money, guns, police protection, and city hall connections, and the operators he was pressuring had none of those things. St. Clair refused. What followed is described across multiple historical accounts as a running war, with reported figures putting the death toll at more than 40, along with kidnappings on both sides. Johnson led her fighting. His own wife later described it as guerrilla warfare, and the reason it could be sustained at all is that Johnson's people could move through Harlem in ways white gangsters from downtown simply could not. The war itself wasn't fought with the kind of open street battles that make for easy archive footage. Most of it played out through kidnappings of runners and lower-level operators, forced buyouts of small banks at gunpoint, and periodic outright violence when a bank refused to fold. The 40-plus deaths attributed to the conflict were spread across roughly 2 years, rather than concentrated into a single dramatic event, which is part of why it doesn't get the cinematic treatment other 1930s gang wars do. It was slow, grinding attrition, and St. Clair's operation absorbed real losses without collapsing. On paper, Schultz won. He took much of the territory. St. Clair's operation was badly damaged and she went into hiding for periods. But she never handed it over, and she never took a deal, and that distinction is the whole point of this story. Schultz took ground from her. He never got her signature. Then, Schultz made a mistake that had nothing to do with Harlem. He announced a plan to assassinate the special prosecutor Thomas Dewey. The emerging Mafia commission, Luciano and the others, judged that killing a prosecutor would bring down heat on the entire underworld and vetoed it. In October 1935, Dutch Schultz was shot in a New Jersey chop house on orders traced back to that commission. And here is the moment. As he lay dying, a telegram arrived for him with words attributed to it saying that whatever a person plants, that is what they will eventually harvest. A line pulled from an old proverb about consequences catching up. It was signed by her. I want to flag that this is one of the most repeated stories in Harlem history, and it is not documented the way a court record is. It comes down to us through reporting and retelling, so I'm presenting it as the story that has followed her ever since, not as confirmed fact. But it has been attached to her name for 90 years, and nothing about the rest of her life makes it implausible. Understand exactly what moved into the vacuum Schultz left behind, because the arrangement that followed is the whole reason this story has an ending worth telling. Schultz's death didn't return Harlem's numbers game to the operators who'd run it before him. It created a negotiation. Luciano's commission had just demonstrated, in the most public way possible, that it could reach into anyone's operation and end it, including a made gangster with City Hall connections. Every numbers banker left in Harlem understood that lesson immediately. What the commission offered, according to multiple historical accounts, was not a takeover. It was closer to a franchise arrangement. Local operators kept running their own books, kept their own runners and controllers, kept the day-to-day structure they'd already built, in exchange for a percentage of the take flowing upward as tribute. Nobody sent Italian management to sit in a Harlem storefront. The tribute was the entire relationship. For an operator, saying yes meant real protection from the police, from rival takeover attempts, and from the commission itself. It meant continuing to earn, just with a smaller share. For most of Harlem's surviving numbers bankers, that was an easy trade. Bumpy Johnson took it, and the deal made him the recognized authority the commission dealt with whenever it wanted anything handled in Harlem, a position closer to a franchise operator than an employee, but a franchise operator all the same. It's the arrangement his entire later reputation was built on. Enforcement of the tribute arrangement, once it was in place, didn't require constant violence either. The threat that had just been demonstrated on Schultz was usually enough. An operator who considered skimming their payment upward had a very recent, very public example of what the commission did to people who crossed it. That's part of why the arrangement could run quietly for decades without needing to be renegotiated at gunpoint every few years. The deal, once made, mostly enforced itself. St. Clair was offered the same terms everyone else was offered. This is the detail that gets lost in most retellings of her story. She wasn't frozen out of the new arrangement. She turned it down. She had spent years and buried people fighting exactly this outcome under Schultz's name. Paying tribute to Luciano instead of Schultz was still paying tribute. And she had already answered that question the only way she was ever going to answer it. She withdrew from the numbers business rather than operate under that tribute. So the woman who built it, who trained the man who inherited it, who took out the newspaper advertisements, did the prison time, and sent the telegram, walked away from the business rather than pay. Her later life was smaller and harder. There was a marriage to a man named Sufi Abdul Hamid that ended very badly, including a conviction after she shot him. The exact charge, outcome, and sentence vary between accounts, so treat the specifics as reported rather than confirmed. She lived quietly afterward and died in the 1960s, largely out of public view. Compare that to what happened to the man she trained. Johnson's later years were also marked by prison time and federal attention, but they were also marked by nightclub friendships, newspaper profiles, and eventually the kind of posthumous fame that produces a Hollywood series decades after his death. St. Clair's own name barely surfaces outside of academic Harlem histories and, more recently, a handful of YouTube videos trying to correct the record, this one included. Almost no money, almost no coverage, no film, just a woman who, by every account that exists, held a line nobody else on this channel's roster ever held, for a cause that got her nothing but the fact of having held it. Bumpy Johnson took the Luciano deal, and it bought him 30 years as Harlem's recognized boss and an ordinary death at 62, surrounded by people who had known him since he was a kid on these same streets. Stephanie St. Clair is the one who was offered that exact same deal and said no, and then simply stopped rather than take it. 900 miles west, a different man got a different answer because in Chicago, somebody did the arithmetic and decided he was not worth the trouble. Eric Paulson, 38 years old in October 1959, was exactly the kind of prisoner that Alcatraz was designed to contain: violent, sadistic, racist, and utterly unrepentant about any of it. Paulson stood 6 feet 4 inches tall, weighed approximately 275 pounds of muscle, built through years of prison weightlifting, and had been convicted of 3 separate murders, all of black men, committed during armed robberies in Texas between 1954 and 1956. According to court records and prison files, Paulson had specifically targeted black victims because, in his own words during his trial, killing, racial slur, isn't really murder, it's pest control. He'd shown no remorse during sentencing, had laughed when the judge called him a racist monster, and had promised he'd kill more black people if he ever got out of prison. Alcatraz received Paulson in 1957 after he'd assaulted multiple black prisoners at other federal facilities, making him too dangerous to house in regular prisons. At Alcatraz, Paulson continued his pattern of racist violence and intimidation, but in a more calculated way that avoided the kind of obvious attacks that would land him in solitary confinement indefinitely. Paulson was smart about how he terrorized people, says Marcus Williams, a black inmate who served at Alcatraz from 1958 to 1964 and who witnessed the incident involving Johnson. Williams spoke with Prison Chronicles in 1968. He didn't just attack people openly where guards would see. He'd do little things that humiliated and intimidated, but that weren't technically violent enough to get him thrown in the hole. He'd take food off black prisoners' trays during meals. He'd bump into black prisoners in the shower or in the yard, making it look accidental, but doing it hard enough to hurt. He'd whisper racial slurs when guards weren't close enough to hear. He'd make it clear that he considered black prisoners to be beneath him, that he thought Alcatraz was too good for racial slur, that we should all be working in fields or cleaning toilets rather than housed with white criminals who'd committed real crimes. By October 1959, Paulson had been at Alcatraz for 2 years and had established himself as someone who intimidated most prisoners, not just black inmates, but even white inmates who didn't want to risk confrontation with someone that large and that violent. Guards tolerated Paulson's behavior to a degree because he was smart enough not to cross the line into attacks that would require serious punishment, and because some guards, though this was never officially acknowledged, shared Paulson's racist views and quietly approved of how he kept racial slur in their place. Paulson thought he was untouchable, Williams recalls. He'd killed 3 black men on the outside and felt no guilt about it. He was bigger and stronger than almost anyone at Alcatraz, and he'd been getting away with his intimidation tactics for 2 years without serious consequences. So, when Bumpy Johnson arrived in 1953 and established respect among other prisoners, Paulson saw that as a challenge. He saw this older black man. Bumpy was 54 in October 1959, while Paulson was only 38, getting respect from both black and white prisoners, and Paulson couldn't stand it. He couldn't stand seeing a racial slur being treated like he mattered. So Paulson decided he was going to humiliate Bumpy, break him down, show everyone that no racial slur was above being put in his place by a superior white man. The escalating confrontation between Eric Paulson and Bumpy Johnson began on Friday, October 16, 1959, during the lunch meal period in Alcatraz's main cafeteria. According to witnesses, Johnson was sitting at a table with 3 other black inmates, eating quietly, when Paulson walked past carrying his own tray. Without breaking stride, Paulson reached down and took Johnson's dessert, a small piece of apple pie that was part of the standard meal, and continued walking to his own table, where he sat down and ate the pie while staring at Johnson with obvious contempt. According to witnesses, Johnson looked at where his dessert had been, looked at Paulson eating it, and then returned to eating his own meal without any visible reaction. Everyone at Bumpy's table was ready to fight, Williams recalls. We were ready to stand up and confront Paulson for disrespecting Bumpy like that. But Bumpy just shook his head slightly, telling us to stay calm, and kept eating like nothing had happened. We didn't understand at first. We thought maybe Bumpy was afraid of Paulson because Paulson was so big. But later we understood Bumpy was giving Paulson rope to hang himself. Bumpy was letting Paulson think he could get away with disrespect so that Paulson would keep escalating until he crossed the line where Bumpy could respond with overwhelming violence that would be justified as self-defense. The second incident occurred on Monday, October 19th, in the communal shower area. Johnson was showering when Paulson entered, walked directly toward Johnson despite plenty of other shower stations being available, and shoved Johnson hard enough that Johnson slipped on the wet floor and had to catch himself against the wall to avoid falling. "That's my shower," racial slur, Paulson said loudly enough that everyone in the shower area heard clearly. "Find another one. This one's for white men only." According to witnesses, Johnson stood up slowly, water dripping from his body, and looked at Paulson for several seconds without speaking. Then Johnson simply moved to a different shower station and finished washing without saying anything or showing any anger. Again, everyone watching thought Bumpy was being weak, Williams says. Paulson had just physically assaulted him and used a racial slur, and Bumpy just walked away. But those of us who knew Bumpy from his reputation understood what he was doing. He was making Paulson confident. He was making Paulson think Bumpy was an easy target who could be pushed around, and that confidence would make Paulson careless. The third incident occurred on Wednesday, October 21st, during the outdoor recreation period, when inmates were allowed in the prison yard for 1 hour. Johnson was walking the perimeter of the yard with 2 other inmates when Paulson deliberately blocked their path. "Get out of my way, racial slur," Paulson said, standing directly in front of Johnson. "I walk straight. You walk around. That's how it works in here. White men walk straight. Racial slurs walk around." According to witnesses, Johnson looked at Paulson for a moment, then simply stepped off the path and walked around him without responding to the racial slur or the confrontation. Paulson laughed loudly and called after Johnson, "That's right, racial slur. You know your place. You keep walking around white men like a good racial slur should." By Wednesday evening, October 21st, everyone at Alcatraz was talking about the confrontations between Paulson and Johnson. Some inmates thought Johnson was showing weakness by not responding to Paulson's provocations. Others, particularly older inmates who understood prison politics better, suspected Johnson was planning something and was waiting for the right moment. "I talked to Bumpy Wednesday night in our cell block," Williams recalls. "I asked him why he wasn't standing up to Paulson, and Bumpy smiled slightly and said, 'I'm giving him enough rope to hang himself. Right now, if I attack him, guards will see it as me starting a fight and I'll go to solitary. But if I let him keep pushing, eventually he'll do something that crosses the line. And then I can respond in a way that guards will understand was justified. Be patient. This will resolve itself very soon." The final escalation occurred on Thursday, October 22nd, the day before the cafeteria incident that would become legendary. During the afternoon recreation period, Paulson approached a young black inmate named Robert Jackson, 23, who was sitting alone on a bench reading a book. "What are you reading, boy?" Paulson asked, snatching the book from Jackson's hands. "Are there pictures in it?" "I didn't know racial slurs could read words without pictures." According to witnesses, Jackson, who was small, maybe 140 pounds, serving time for postal fraud, and who'd never been violent, tried to take his book back politely. "Please give that back, sir. I was reading it." Paulson responded by hitting Jackson across the face with the book, knocking Jackson off the bench onto the ground, and then throwing the book into a puddle of dirty water that had collected near a drain. "That's what I think of racial slurs who think they're smart enough to read," Paulson said, standing over Jackson, who was holding his face where he'd been hit. "You're not smart. You're not equal to white men. You're racial slurs. And racial slurs belong on the ground where I just put you." Guards broke up the confrontation before it went further, but they didn't punish Paulson severely. He received a verbal warning and lost 1 day of recreation privileges. Jackson was sent to the infirmary with a split lip and a black eye. That evening, Bumpy Johnson sat with several other black inmates in their cell block, and according to Williams, who was present, Johnson made a statement that everyone understood meant something was going to happen very soon. Tomorrow at lunch, Paulson is going to learn a lesson he'll remember for the rest of his life. "I've been patient. I've let him think he can disrespect me without consequences. I've let him think that being big and violent makes him untouchable. But tomorrow, he's going to understand that size doesn't matter when someone has the intelligence and the willingness to use violence more strategically than he does. Tomorrow, Alcatraz is going to see what happens when a racist bully picks the wrong target." The main cafeteria at Alcatraz, Federal Penitentiary, seated approximately 250 inmates at long tables arranged in rows, with guards stationed at strategic positions around the perimeter, watching for any signs of trouble. Meals were regimented. Inmates filed in, received their food, sat at assigned tables, ate in silence or with minimal conversation, and filed out within 45 minutes. Violence during meals was relatively rare because guards had clear sight lines to every table, and because inmates knew that starting a fight in the cafeteria would result in immediate solitary confinement. On Friday, October 23, 1959, at approximately 12:15 p.m., inmates filed into the cafeteria for lunch. Bumpy Johnson, wearing the standard prison-issue clothing, received his food tray and walked to his assigned table, where he sat with 3 other inmates and began eating quietly. Eric Paulson entered the cafeteria 2 minutes later, received his tray, and instead of going to his own assigned table, walked directly to Johnson's table and sat down in an empty seat across from Johnson, setting his tray down with deliberate force. "Well, well," Paulson said loudly enough that nearby tables could hear. "If it isn't Harlem's racial slur king. Still eating with your racial slur friends, I see. Still thinking you're somebody important instead of just another racial slur who belongs in a cage." According to witnesses, Johnson continued eating without looking up, without acknowledging Paulson's presence or his racial slurs. This non-response seemed to anger Paulson, who wanted a reaction. "You ignoring me, boy?" Paulson said, leaning forward across the table toward Johnson. "You think you're too good to respond when a white man talks to you? Let me explain something. Racial slur. You're not too good for anything. You're a racial slur. That means you're beneath me. That means when I talk to you, you respond respectfully or you face consequences." Paulson then turned his attention to Robert Jackson, the young inmate Paulson had hit with a book the previous day, who was sitting 3 tables away. Jackson's face still showed bruising from where Paulson had struck him. "Hey, racial slur boy," Paulson shouted across the cafeteria at Jackson. "How's your face feeling today? You learn your lesson about reading books you're not smart enough to understand? Maybe I need to come over there and teach you another lesson." Jackson, according to witnesses, looked down at his food, trying to avoid Paulson's attention, clearly terrified. Some of the other black inmates at Jackson's table started to stand up, preparing to defend him if Paulson approached, but guards shouted for everyone to remain seated. And then Bumpy Johnson stood up. According to 17 witnesses who saw what happened next, the entire sequence of events lasted approximately 3 to 4 seconds. Johnson stood up from his seat at the table, and as he stood, his right hand moved to his waist, where his prison shirt was tucked, into his pants. In one smooth motion that was so fast that most witnesses didn't clearly see it happen, Johnson withdrew something from where it had been hidden against his body. A blade approximately 4 inches long that had been fashioned from a piece of metal sharpened to a razor edge, a weapon that in prison parlance was called a shank, and that experienced inmates could make from various materials and hide in ways that even thorough searches often missed. Johnson walked around the table toward where Paulson was sitting, moving quickly but not running, covering the 8 feet between them in approximately 2 seconds. Paulson saw Johnson approaching and started to stand up, his hands moving to defend himself or to attack. But Johnson was faster. Johnson's right arm moved in a horizontal slash across Paulson's face from left to right, a motion that took less than 1 second, and the shank's blade cut a deep gash across Paulson's face from his left cheekbone to his right jaw, opening a wound approximately 7 inches long that immediately began pouring blood. Paulson screamed, a sound witnesses describe as shock and pain combined, and his hands went to his face, trying to stop the blood that was now flowing down his neck and onto his prison shirt. But Johnson wasn't finished. Before guards could react, before Paulson could defend himself, before anyone could intervene, Johnson's arm moved again, this time in an upward diagonal slash from lower right to upper left, and the blade cut another deep gash across Paulson's face, this one crossing the first wound at an angle and catching Paulson's right eye, slicing through the eyelid and into the eye itself. Paulson collapsed backwards, falling over the bench he'd been sitting on, landing on the cafeteria floor in a spreading pool of his own blood, screaming continuously now, his hands covering his ruined eye, blood streaming through his fingers. The entire cafeteria erupted in chaos. Guards rushed toward the scene, blowing whistles, shouting orders for everyone to get down on the floor. Inmates scattered or dove under tables. Within 15 seconds, 5 guards had surrounded Johnson with weapons drawn, while 2 other guards went to Paulson, who was writhing on the floor, blood pooling around him from the 2 facial wounds. Johnson dropped the blade on the floor, held his hands up to show he was no longer armed, and allowed guards to force him to the ground and handcuff him without resistance. But before guards could drag Johnson away, before they could get Paulson medical attention, Johnson said one sentence that every witness heard clearly, and that would be repeated in prisons across America for the next 50 years. Touch that young brother again, call him one more racial slur, and next time you won't visit a doctor, you'll visit God. Eric Paulson survived the attack, but was permanently disfigured and partially blinded. The first slash across his face required 127 stitches and left a scar that ran from his left cheekbone to his right jaw, a mark that he would carry for the rest of his life. The second slash destroyed his right eye completely, requiring emergency surgery to remove what remained of the eyeball and leaving Paulson blind on his right side permanently. Paulson was transferred to the prison hospital, where he remained for 2 weeks, recovering from his injuries. According to medical staff who treated him, Paulson was a changed man after the attack. Quiet, withdrawn, no longer aggressive or threatening. The physical damage was severe, but the psychological damage was perhaps worse. Paulson had believed himself to be untouchable because of his size and his violent reputation, and Johnson had destroyed that belief in 3 seconds. Paulson never threatened another black prisoner after that attack, says Williams. He'd learned what every bully eventually learns if they live long enough. Size and strength don't matter when someone has a weapon, and the willingness to use it without hesitation. Bumpy had shown everyone at Alcatraz that being 275 pounds of muscle meant nothing against someone who understood violence at a deeper level, who could strike faster than you could defend, who could permanently damage you before you even realized you were in danger. Bumpy Johnson was immediately placed in solitary confinement pending investigation. The investigation lasted 2 weeks and included interviews with dozens of witnesses. What investigators discovered was exactly what Johnson had calculated. Multiple witnesses testified that Paulson had been harassing and threatening black prisoners for weeks, including taking Johnson's food, shoving Johnson in the showers, blocking Johnson's path in the yard, and using racial slurs constantly. Witnesses testified that Paulson had physically assaulted Robert Jackson the day before the cafeteria incident, hitting him with a book and knocking him to the ground while calling him racial slurs. Witnesses testified that on the day of the attack, Paulson had sat at Johnson's table uninvited, had used racial slurs toward Johnson repeatedly, and had then threatened Jackson across the cafeteria. Johnson's own statement to investigators was simple and consistent. I defended myself and another inmate from a racist prisoner who'd been threatening us for a week. I used the minimum force necessary to ensure he would stop threatening us. I had warned him. I told him after the attack that if he continued his behavior, consequences would be worse next time. I don't regret defending myself. I don't regret defending Robert Jackson. I regret that violence was necessary, but it was necessary because guards weren't protecting us from Paulson's harassment. After 2 weeks in solitary confinement, prison officials made a decision that surprised many people. Johnson would receive additional time in solitary, 30 days total, for possession of a weapon and for assault, but he would not face additional years added to his sentence because investigators concluded that Johnson had been provoked by Paulson's sustained harassment and that the attack, while excessive in its violence, was understandable given the circumstances. The prison administration didn't want to admit it publicly, Williams explains, but they knew Paulson had been terrorizing black inmates for years and that guards had done nothing to stop it. They knew Paulson had assaulted Jackson the day before. They knew Paulson was sitting at Bumpy's table using racial slurs and threatening another inmate when Bumpy attacked him. So punishing Bumpy too severely would mean admitting that the prison administration had failed to protect inmates from a known racist bully. Instead, they gave Bumpy 30 days in the hole, enough punishment to satisfy rules against weapons and violence, and then they quietly transferred Paulson to another facility when he recovered, effectively admitting that Paulson was the problem, not Bumpy. Bumpy Johnson was released from Alcatraz in November 1963 after serving 10 years of his 15-year sentence. He returned to Harlem, reclaimed control of his criminal empire, and lived until July 1968 when he died of a heart attack at age 62. 2 down. If you want more of this, the deals, the refusals, the arrangements nobody ever wrote down, subscribe. So who was Teddy Rowe? He came into the world on August 26, 1898, in Galliano, Louisiana, deep in the bayou, about as far from power as a human being could get. His father was a sharecropper. That meant he worked someone else's land, paid rent with a portion of the harvest, and stayed poor no matter what he did. It was legal slavery with a receipt. Rowe was raised in Little Rock, Arkansas. He never received a single day of formal education. Not one. Everything he ever learned he taught himself or learned on the street. He was self-taught. As a boy, he worked for a tailor, running errands and learning to sew. That skill would follow him his entire life. Years later, when he was the most powerful black racketeer in Chicago, when he had a wardrobe that made movie stars jealous, people would ask where he got his suits made. He made them himself. The man could sew a suit by hand and shoot a Mafia enforcer in the face on the same day. And he had another quality that set him apart from almost every other black man in his era. Teddy Rowe could pass for white. His complexion was light enough that, in certain rooms, certain settings, people assumed he was Italian or Mediterranean or anything other than what he was. In Jim Crow America, that ability was a weapon. It gave him access to places, information, and conversations that no one expected a black man to hear. By his early 20s, Rowe was bootlegging. He was making money, building a reputation as a man who was reliable, tough, and not to be trifled with. When he married Carrie in 1923, he tried to go straight. He moved to Detroit and worked in an automobile plant. But the job did not last. He was laid off. With no money, no prospects, and no education, Rowe did what millions of black Americans had done before him, and he headed for Chicago. He arrived on the South Side in the late 1920s, and he walked into a world that would make him a king. Why Al Capone stayed away. In the 1930s, on the South Side of Chicago, in the neighborhood called Bronzeville, there was an underground economy that was bigger than most legitimate businesses in the city. It was called the policy game, a street lottery. You paid a nickel and you picked your numbers. If your numbers hit, you got paid. It was illegal, it was wildly popular, and it generated millions of dollars every single year. The men who ran the policy wheels were called the Policy Kings. In an era when segregation locked black Americans out of banks, out of business loans, and out of the legitimate economy entirely, the Policy Kings were the community. They were the employers. They were the banks. The famous writer Richard Wright once said of them, they would have been steel tycoons, Wall Street brokers, and auto moguls had they been white. Now here is the part that most people don't know. The part that tells you everything about how dangerous Teddy Rowe really was. Al Capone knew about the policy game. Of course he did. Capone controlled Chicago. He controlled the police, the politicians, the judges, the unions, the bootlegging, the gambling, everything. His organization, the Chicago Outfit, was the most powerful criminal enterprise in America. Capone had taken over the North Side by machine gunning 7 men in a garage. He had taken over Cicero by sending 200 armed men into the streets on Election Day. He had taken over the labor unions by bombing businesses that refused to comply. Al Capone did not ask permission. Al Capone took what he wanted, from everyone, except the South Side. Capone sent scouts into the Black Belt. They came back with reports, and the reports all said the same thing. The men who ran the policy game were not soft. They were not businessmen pretending to be tough. They were armed, organized, deeply embedded in a community that would die for them, and led by a man, Teddy Rowe, who had a reputation for settling disputes with a pistol, not a handshake. Capone's men had seen what happened to people who tried to muscle in on Rowe's territory. They had heard what Rowe did to collectors who betrayed him. They knew that Rowe's crew included off-duty Chicago police officers who were loyal to him, not to the department. And they knew that starting a war on the South Side meant fighting in neighborhoods where every face was hostile, every alley was a trap, and the man at the top would rather die shooting than surrender a single dollar. So Capone did something he almost never did. He backed off. His men would stay out of the South Side. The policy racket belonged to the black community. In exchange, the policy kings would stay out of the beer and liquor business. Capone controlled booze. The kings controlled numbers. Each side stayed in its lane. But make no mistake about what that deal really was. That wasn't a partnership between equals. That wasn't diplomacy. That was Al Capone, the most feared man in America, looking at Teddy Rowe and deciding that the cost of war was too high, that the man on the other side of that line was too dangerous, that the South Side of Chicago was the one place in the city where the Italian Mafia could not simply walk in and take over. That deal held for nearly 20 years. Through Capone's reign, through his imprisonment, through the transition of power to the men who came after him. For 2 decades, the South Side of Chicago was the one piece of territory that the Italian Mafia did not control. And then Capone was gone, and the new generation, younger, hungrier, and stupid enough to think they were tougher than the men who came before them, decided to break the old deal. They had no idea what they were walking into. The man in the mirror fireplace. In 1946, the Italian Mafia made its move. The boss sent his most ambitious soldier, the young killer who had learned about the policy game while sharing a prison cell with a policy king who had foolishly trusted him. He had pumped his cellmate for every detail, the money, the structure, the operations, the weaknesses, and now he had the backing of the entire organization. The first move was a kidnapping. They snatched the biggest policy king in Chicago, grabbed him off the street, and held him for 5 days with tape over his eyes and cotton in his ears. The ransom was $100,000 in cash and a promise to hand over the entire policy operation. Teddy Rowe paid the ransom. His boss was released, but the message was clear. The outfit was taking over. Pay the street tax, hand over control, or die. This is where the story splits. This is where one man's decision changed everything. The policy king who had been kidnapped took his money and fled to Mexico. His brother went with him. They were never heard from in Chicago again. Then, one by one, every other major policy operator on the South Side made the same choice. Some paid the tax, some handed over their wheels, some simply vanished, packed a bag in the middle of the night, and drove until they hit a state line. The outfit was too powerful. The violence was too extreme. The message was too clear. Within months, practically every black numbers operator in Chicago had either surrendered or disappeared. Every single one, except Teddy Rowe. When the outfit came to him with the same demand, pay the tax, hand over control, or face the consequences, Rowe did not negotiate. He did not ask for terms. He did not stall for time. He said no, flat, final, absolute. And then he did not run. He did not hide. He did not leave Chicago. He took over everything. The outfit sent enforcers into the black wards. They bombed Rowe's house. They fired shots at his wife and children. They beat up his collectors on the street. They took over gambling parlors. They set up their own bookie joints in taverns, barber shops, even church parking lots, anywhere they could plant a flag in territory that had belonged to black operators for decades. In 6 months, 12 Italian mob soldiers and an unknown number of Rowe's men turned up dead on Chicago's streets and in its back alleys. Now the Italians understood why Al Capone had stayed away. Now they understood what the old boss had seen and calculated when he looked at the South Side and decided it was not worth the blood. Capone had been smart enough to respect the danger. These younger men had been arrogant enough to ignore it. They were paying for that arrogance in body bags. Every time they hit him, he hit back. Every time they took a parlor, he took one back. Every time they sent a message, he sent a louder one. His survival alone was an act of defiance. The fact that he was still alive, still operating, still collecting bets and paying winners, that was a humiliation for the outfit. They had the entire Chicago underworld under their control. They had hundreds of soldiers, they had police captains, aldermen, judges, and they couldn't break one man. The black community rallied behind Rowe like he was a general in a war, because that's exactly what he was. People started placing their bets with Rowe, specifically because he was fighting. Gambling with Teddy Rowe became an act of resistance. His business didn't shrink during the war, it grew. The more the outfit attacked him, the more customers he attracted. The South Side was voting with its nickels. Finally, the outfit's top boss tried a different approach. He sat down with Rowe personally. No soldiers, no threats, just 2 men in a room. The boss offered Rowe $250,000 in cash, an astronomical sum, enough to retire, enough to disappear, enough to live comfortably for the rest of his life. The deal was simple. Take the money and walk away. Quit the policy rackets. Let the outfit have the South Side. Rowe didn't flinch. He didn't think about it. He didn't ask for a day to consider. He looked the most dangerous man in Chicago in the eye and said he would die first. If he was going down, he would go down like a man. He said he did not run, and he told the boss to remember that. The boss leaned back and said, "Well, buddy boy, you just might." After that meeting, Rowe told reporters, pounding his chest with his fist, that they would have to kill him to take him. He was not performing. He was not posturing. This was the same man who had made Al Capone think twice. The same man who had left bodies in alleys and walked home to press his suit for the next morning. The same man who had been settling disputes with a revolver since before these young Italian soldiers were old enough to hold a gun. He was making a statement of fact, and the Italian Mafia, for the first time in their history, was dealing with a man who meant every word. In the summer of 1951, the outfit sent a crew to kidnap Teddy Rowe. Not to kill him, to kidnap him the way they had kidnapped his old boss years earlier. Grab him, hold him, squeeze him until he broke. The crew was led by a made man, a full member of the Italian Mafia, sworn in with blood and oaths. He was a soldier, an enforcer, a killer who had been doing the outfit's dirty work for years. He was also the brother of one of the outfit's most feared captains. This was not a low-level thug. This was someone who was supposed to be untouchable. They set up along a South Side street and flagged Roe's car down, pretending to be police officers. Roe pulled over. He demanded identification. Before he could process what was happening, they jumped him. But Teddy Roe was always armed, and Teddy Roe did not freeze. A fight broke out between Roe and the made man. Punches, grappling, and then a gunshot. Roe pulled his pistol and fired. The made man dropped with a bullet through his head, dead on the street. Another attacker took a round in the shoulder. The rest of the crew scrambled into their car and fled. Think about what just happened. In 1951, in Jim Crow America, in a city controlled by the Italian Mafia, in a neighborhood where the police worked for the outfit, a black man had just shot and killed a made member of the Chicago mob in a street gunfight, in broad daylight, and walked away alive. In the entire history of organized crime in America, made men were untouchable. Killing one was a declaration of war against the entire organization. It had almost never happened, and when it did, the person responsible usually ended up in a ditch within 48 hours. Teddy Roe ended up in a courtroom, charged with murder. His lawyers argued self-defense. They were able to prove connections between prosecutors and the mob, causing key evidence to be thrown out. He was denied bail 6 times before and during the trial. The jury acquitted him. When word spread through the South Side that Teddy Roe killed an Italian-made man and beat the case, he transcended gangster status. He became something larger, a symbol, proof that a black man could stand up to the most powerful criminal organization in America and not just survive, but win. A Chicago police detective who transported Roe to court later told his son that the people of the neighborhood loved Roe. He was like a Robin Hood to them. He was respected because he refused to give in to the Italians. You know how they say a crook with honor? That describes Roe. After the killing, the outfit launched a brutal campaign of revenge against every black bookmaker in Chicago. Dozens were shot at, beaten, or driven out of the city permanently. The message was clear. This is what happens when you associate with Teddy Roe. Roe retreated to his mansion on South Michigan Avenue. He hired bodyguards, off-duty police officers, armed men, a small army stationed around his home at all times. For months, he did not leave. He ran his operation from behind fortified walls, protected by guns and loyalty, waiting for whatever came next. On August 1st, 1952, what came next was not a bullet. Doctors told him he had inoperable stomach cancer. Terminal. He was dying, not from the outfit, not from a shotgun, from a disease that no amount of money or firepower could stop. And Teddy Roe made one final decision. He sent his bodyguards home, every single one. He dismissed the entire security detail. He did not need them anymore. He was going to die on his own terms, not behind walls, not surrounded by guards, not hiding. 3 days later, on the evening of August 4th, 1952, Theodore Teddy Roe put on a 3-piece suit, a pressed shirt, and a hat, the same way he had dressed every day of his adult life. The sharecropper's son, who had taught himself to sew, who had built $1 million empire from nickels, who had killed a made man with his own hands and beaten the charge, he dressed himself one last time like the king he was. He told his wife Carrie he was going out. He walked out the front door of 5239 South Michigan Avenue. Mafia hitmen were already parked on the street. They had been watching, waiting. As Roe approached his car, someone called his name, Roe. He turned. 5 blasts from two 12-gauge shotguns hit him in the back, the jaw, and the face. He never had a chance to pull his revolver. He died slumped against a tree on the sidewalk outside his own home. He was 53 years old. His wife heard the gunshots. She screamed his name. No answer. She opened the door and found him in a pool of blood on the pavement. The next morning, the Chicago newspapers reported that the king is dead. Teddy Rowe was laid out in a casket that cost $5,000. In 1952, that was more than most families earned in a year. His funeral was the largest for any black person in Chicago since Jack Johnson, the first African-American world heavyweight boxing champion, had died in 1946. Over 6,000 people came to the church on Wabash Avenue. Thousands more lined the streets outside. 81 cars followed the hearse in a funeral procession that stretched for blocks through the South Side. People wept openly. Strangers held each other. The entire community stopped to mourn a man who had done what no one else had dared to do. The minister stood before the mourners and said, "He was a friend of man, and he had a pure heart." No one was ever charged with his murder. Police questioned a dozen high-ranking members of the Italian Mafia, including the very men who had orchestrated the takeover of the policy game. But no charges were filed. No trial, no justice. The outfit had won. After Rowe's death, the Italian Mafia seized complete control of the South Side policy racket. Within a few years, the numbers game became their most profitable operation, bringing in $150 million per year. The money that had once flowed through black-owned businesses, employed black workers, and funded black institutions was now in Italian hands. The economic backbone of the South Side was broken. The community that Teddy Rowe had fought to protect was dismantled, not by the police, not by the government, but by the same men who had come for Rowe and found one man standing in their way for 6 years while every other man in the city ran. And 20 years later, on a federal wiretap, the boss who had ordered Rowe's murder said words that proved, even in death, even after 2 decades, Teddy Rowe had earned the one thing the Italian Mafia almost never gave anyone: respect. I'll say this, black or no black, that bastard went out like a man. He had balls. That was Teddy Rowe, the boy who never went to school, the bootlegger who taught himself to sew, the Robin Hood who paid for funerals and hospital bills, the policy king who killed a made man with his bare hands and beat the murder charge, the man who was offered $250,000 to walk away and said, "I'll die first," the man who learned he was dying of cancer, sent his guards home, put on a 3-piece suit, and walked out the front door one last time. They killed him, but they never broke him, and the South Side of Chicago never forgot his name. The last man on this list did that better than anyone who has ever done it, and the Detroit Mafia did not hire him. They came to depend on him. Chester Wheeler Campbell was born in 1930 in Detroit. He was the 4th of 6 children. His father died when Chester was in the 2nd grade, and his mother raised 6 kids alone. Here is what made Chester different from every other gangster you have ever heard of. He was the only one in his family who went criminal. 5 siblings, all of them law-abiding, one mother doing her best, and one son who chose a different path. By the age of 15, he was incarcerated for burglary in 1946, a child in a cell. Whatever chance he had at a normal life ended before he could drive. By the age of 20, he faced 2 more burglary charges. His photograph was already displayed in the precinct station house. The cops knew his face, and they were watching him, waiting. They did not have to wait long. On July 1st, 1955, in Detroit, on Lawton Street, Chester was 24 years old. He and 2 partners, David Green and Watson Brooks, planned to rob a numbers spot, a gambling apartment. They masked their faces with handkerchiefs. They had 2 pistols between them. Outside the apartment, they encountered Luther Mixon, 43 years old, standing near an expensive car. The robbers demanded to know who owned it. Mixon said nothing. Campbell pistol whipped him. Mixon fell and tried to get back on his feet. Campbell fired a round into his face. Then they went inside the apartment. Inside were 4 people: John and Julia Jackson, Roosevelt Williams, and Emmett Carter. They robbed them all at gunpoint and beat them. Their total take was $420, including what they pulled from the pockets of the man bleeding out in the street. $420 for a man's life. They arrested Campbell the next day. An officer recognized him from the precinct wall photo, the same photo they had been staring at for years. The witnesses from the apartment identified him in a lineup. He was charged with first-degree murder in January 1956 and sent to Michigan State Prison, known as Jackson Prison, one of the most violent penitentiaries in America. Chester Wheeler Campbell walked in as a street robber who killed a man over $420. 13 years later, he walked out as something else entirely. Here's what nobody expected. Campbell didn't waste a single day inside Jackson Prison. While other inmates fought and gambled and waited for parole, Chester studied. He studied criminal law, homicide investigation techniques, and foreign languages. He read everything he could find: books on surveillance, books on espionage, books on forensics. He scored near genius level on a court-administered IQ test. He learned new criminal trades from the most dangerous men in Michigan: safe cracking, weapons, drug distribution networks, the economics of heroin, who controlled what in Detroit, Cleveland, and Chicago. 13 years. That's how long Chester Wheeler Campbell spent preparing for what came next. In September 1969, he pleaded his case down to second-degree murder. The court transcript is chilling because of how calm he is. The judge asked, "Do you know where he was killed?" Campbell answered, "On the street." The judge said, "Tell me the circumstances." Campbell said, "In the process, I shot Mr. Mixon." The judge asked, "After that, what happened?" Campbell said, "I think I went through his pockets." He said it like he was recalling a trip to the grocery store. No remorse, no emotion, just facts. They paroled him in September 1969. He was 38 years old. Within 1 month, police suspected him in a double homicide. Jimmy Davis and his girlfriend Lisa were both shot execution style in the head while sitting in a parked car. Davis had been a protected witness in trials against heroin kingpin John Klassen. The man who was supposed to be safe, who the government promised to protect, was dead with a bullet in his brain within weeks of Chester Wheeler Campbell walking free. But they could not prove it. No witnesses, no evidence connecting Campbell directly. That became the pattern. That was always the pattern. And what Chester did next would make the Italian Mafia take notice. After prison, Chester Wheeler Campbell did not become a drug dealer. He did not become a gang leader. He did not try to build an empire. He became something far more valuable and far more dangerous: a freelance assassin, available to anyone who could pay his fee. His fee was $15,000 per hit, an astronomical, almost unheard of amount in Detroit in the 1970s. But people paid it because Chester Wheeler Campbell did not just kill. He was an artist of death. He wore only black, head to toe, every day, to accentuate what he called his morbid aura. He wanted you to see him coming and to know what he was before he opened his mouth. Here is the contradiction that made him terrifying. This man, this contract killer, spent his free time attending plays, browsing museums, and studying foreign languages. He was cultured, well-spoken, and surprisingly charming. He could walk into a room full of educated people and nobody would suspect what he was. Then he could walk out of that room and execute someone in a parked car before dinner. He used aliases, Augustus Miller and others. He maintained disguises. He had a stolen Toledo police uniform, complete with badge and commander's hat, that he used for surveillance and infiltration. The badge had been reported lost by a Toledo officer who said he misplaced it while helping a disabled motorist. Campbell had probably taken it from a corrupt cop on his payroll. And the notebooks. Always the notebooks. From the moment he left Jackson Prison, Chester began building something unprecedented, a personal intelligence database. Every contact, every conversation, every license plate, every address, every habit of every person, criminal or cop, who crossed his path. He gathered information through surveillance, gossip, shadowing, payoffs, and simply talking to people, from mobsters to motorcycle clubs, hookers to hitmen, pushers to pimps, Detroit to Cleveland. He made the rounds and he wrote everything down. This was not a street thug keeping a score sheet. This was a spy operation run by one man out of the trunk of a rented Oldsmobile. He even had access to the Law Enforcement Information Network, spelled LEIN, the police database. Cops on the drug lord's payroll would run plates for him. He could identify any car, find any address, and track any person. He once told friends at a bar, drink in hand with a slight grin, that he was one of God's unfortunate creatures. He said it like a joke. It was not a joke. Picture the Louisade Social Club, East Side Detroit, early 1970s, a private Italian social club. The kind of place where men in pressed shirts drink espresso and talk business in half sentences, where the walls have no ears because nobody walks in without an invitation. Anthony Giacalone, known as Tony Jack, sits at a table. His brother Vito Giacalone, known as Billy Jack, sits beside him. These are the street-level commanders of the Taco Zerilli crime family, the Detroit Mafia. Tony Jack would later become infamous as one of the men connected to the disappearance of Jimmy Hoffa on July 30th, 1975. That's who we're talking about. A black man walks through the door, head to toe in black. Nobody stops him. Nobody questions him. In a room where no black man should be welcome, Chester Wheeler Campbell sits down at the table. Because the Giacalones had a problem. The heroin trade was exploding, and whoever controlled heroin controlled Detroit. But the old arrangement was dying. The quiet, black, gambling bosses, who had worked for the Italians for years, doing what they were told, staying in their lane, were being replaced. A new generation, independent thinkers, volatile drug kingpins, men who didn't want to pay tribute to the Italians anymore. The Giacalones needed someone who could move through Detroit's black neighborhoods without standing out. Someone who could enforce their heroin operations in territories where an Italian face meant a bullet. Someone whose reputation alone could keep an entire side of the city in line. They didn't find that man. That man found them. Chester Wheeler. Campbell had been freelancing since prison, killing for whoever paid. But the Giacalones offered something better than a fee. They offered infrastructure, supply lines, protection, money, a permanent position in the most powerful crime organization in Michigan. Not as an employee, not as a servant, as their chosen weapon. Campbell was placed in the East Side camp, connected to a crew of black enforcers working directly under the Giacalone wing. Contract killers, extortionists, drug traffickers, a subunit of the Italian Mafia staffed entirely by black men. They would later be called Murder Row, and Chester Wheeler Campbell was the reason anyone feared that name. Around late 1973, Campbell was introduced through mutual acquaintances in the Mafia to two young East Side heroin dealers Frank Usher, known as Big Frank Nitti, and Harold Morton, known as the Hawk. The Giacalone brothers had given Usher his nickname, Big Frank Nitti, after the real Chicago mobster. That tells you everything about the relationship. The Italians weren't just doing business with these men. They were mentoring them, shaping them, building them in their own image. Usher and Morton had ambition. What they lacked was fear. Nobody was afraid of two young dealers. Every corner had young dealers. Then Chester Campbell walked in. Here's how it worked. A dealer owed money, hadn't paid in weeks, thought he could outrun the debt. Campbell didn't chase him, didn't threaten him. He just parked outside the man's house in the morning, in the same rented car, in the same all-black clothes, in the same spot. For 3 days, never got out, never knocked, never said a word. On the 4th day, the man walked out with an envelope full of cash and handed it through the window. That was Chester when things went well. When things didn't go well, bodies turned up in parked cars with bullets in the back of the head and no witnesses within miles. With Campbell's reputation, the Giacalone brothers' money and supply lines, and Usher's ambition, Murder Row became the most powerful drug operation in the entire state of Michigan. Not Detroit, not the East Side, the entire state. The Michigan Federated Democratic Social Club in Midtown became their headquarters. From there, Murder Row expanded operations citywide: gambling, extortion, prostitution. But heroin was the engine. Heroin was always the engine. And here's the thing that nobody talks about. Through all of this, the killings, the heroin, the Italian Mafia, Chester's mother was still alive, still in Detroit, still the same woman who raised 6 kids alone after her husband died. The question was whether you'd see him first. Chester Campbell was suspected in at least 10 homicide investigations between 1969 and 1975. 10 that police knew about. The real number, according to federal authorities, was north of 50. He was never convicted. Not because police didn't try. They tried constantly. They built cases. They found witnesses. They prepared prosecutions. Then the witnesses died. In 1971, he was charged with intent to murder a star witness in a drug trial. The charges were dropped before trial. Then came the Roy Parsons case, a 1972 murder. Police had their witness, a man named James Lee Newton, street name Watusi Slim. Watusi Slim wasn't some random bystander. He was a one-time Campbell confidant and business partner. He knew everything. He could connect Chester to murders going back years. The prosecution thought they finally had the case that would put Campbell away forever. They put Watusi Slim in protective custody, a maximum security federal prison in Ohio. The protection wing, the safest place the government could put a human being short of an underground bunker. It didn't matter. Watusi Slim was found dead, throat cut, eyelids marked with X's, in the protection wing of a maximum security federal prison. The X's on the eyelids. Think about that. That wasn't just murder. That was a message. To every potential witness in every pending case against Chester Wheeler Campbell, we can reach you anywhere, even in the one place the government swears is safe. All murder charges against Campbell were dropped. His lawyer stood before the judge and said it plainly. No shame, no apology. Words that echoed through Detroit's legal system like a gunshot. Chester doesn't need to be physically present to conduct business. The judge heard it. The prosecutors heard it. Every cop in Detroit heard it, and nobody could do a thing about it. February 6th, 1975, the night that changed everything. Chester was driving to his girlfriend's home in Orchard Lake, a wealthy suburb. Campbell had been living 2 lives, killer in the streets of Detroit and gentleman caller in the quiet suburbs. His girlfriend's house was full of his belongings, weapons, documents, and more notebooks. He came around a bend and nearly hit a patrol car. Instead of stopping, instead of showing his license and playing it cool like any smart criminal would, Chester Wheeler. Campbell hit the gas. High-speed chase through a suburb that had never seen one. He ran a police car off the road. More units joined. They finally stopped him. The car was a gold mine. 2 semi-automatic pistols, a rifle, a sawed-off shotgun, several ounces of heroin, and the notebooks. When they searched his house in Detroit and his girlfriend's home in Orchard Lake, the picture got worse. Documents bearing the names, addresses, and personal details of cops, politicians, judges, gangsters, addicts, witnesses, and prosecutors, sealed grand jury files, espionage equipment, the stolen Toledo police uniform and badge, an estimated $250,000 in cash, and a list, what prosecutors would call a hit list, the names and daily habits of people who were already dead, alongside names of people who were still alive. The implication was obvious. The living names were next. Among those names, L. Brooks Patterson, a well-known assistant prosecutor in Oakland County, who would later call Campbell absolutely incorrigible and a dedicated recidivist. 6 law enforcement agencies, Detroit Police, Oakland County, Wayne County, the FBI, the DEA, and the ATF, immediately began fighting over the notebooks. Not cooperating, fighting, because whoever controlled Chester Campbell's intelligence had leverage over the entire Detroit underworld and the police forces that were supposed to be clean. The corruption ran that deep. The Detroit Free Press covered it obsessively. The notebooks didn't just expose criminals, they exposed the true extent of Detroit's rot. Cover-ups, bribes, homicides, espionage, racism, addiction, rampant greed. And Chester knew it. In his cell, he reportedly told a fellow inmate, "I'm a dead man. Whether I stay in here or get out, brother, I'm dead." He wasn't wrong, just not in the way he expected. With Campbell locked up, Murder Row was finished. Not immediately, but inevitably. Chester had been the fear. Without him, the crew was just drug dealers with guns, and Detroit had 1,000 of those. The power inside Murder Row shifted. A lieutenant named Doc Holliday, real name Clarence Hillary, had been waiting for his moment. With Chester gone, Doc decided the leadership needed to change, violently. One night in 1979, at the Michigan Federated Democratic Social Club, Murder Row's own headquarters, Doc Holliday ordered 3 men killed. Not rivals, not enemies. His own people, James McJoy, Herbert Jackson, Alvin Clark. 3 Murder Row members who had sided with Frank Usher over Doc in the internal struggle for control. They were shot. Then it got worse. Doc ordered the bodies dismembered, heads removed, limbs separated, body parts placed into garbage bags. And he forced Frank Usher, the founder of Murder Row, the man the Giacalones had personally mentored, to participate, to pick up a blade and cut apart the bodies of men who had been loyal to him. While it happened, Doc Holliday popped a bottle of champagne, lit a fat cigar, and celebrated. Then he sent 2 men to dump the garbage bags. They were sloppy. The remains were found. The case unraveled. Usher was convicted. Doc Holliday was acquitted, but the streets have their own justice system. In 1983, someone walked up to Doc while he was having a drink at a Detroit night spot and shot him dead. The Giacalone brothers watched all of this from a distance. They had lost their enforcer. Then they had lost their crew. The most powerful black drug operation in Michigan, the one they had personally funded and built, destroyed itself in 4 years without Chester Wheeler Campbell to hold it together. They moved on. They always moved on. New crews, new enforcers, new faces, but they never found another Chester. Chester Wheeler Campbell, the man who had killed 50 people, who had the Italian Mafia on speed dial, who had kept notebooks on every cop in Detroit, looked at the reporters and said, "I don't have anything newsworthy to say." Then he went back to work. In 1987, déjà vu, Chester Wheeler Campbell was pulled over again. Same story, different year. A carload of guns, drugs, explosives, spy gear. Prosecutor L. Brooks Patterson, the same man whose name had appeared in Campbell's notebooks 12 years earlier, stood in court and called Campbell absolutely incorrigible, a dedicated recidivist and a heavy-duty criminal. The sentence was 40 years. Chester was 57 years old. He was never coming home, and everyone in that courtroom knew it. For the next 14 years, Chester Wheeler Campbell sat in a federal prison. He died on a prison bed in a federal medical facility in 2001. The official cause of death was end-stage liver disease, hepatitis C, natural causes. Chester Wheeler Campbell, Dr. Death, the Angel of Death, the Undertaker, 007, died of natural causes. He was 71 years old. Here's what stays with me. Chester Wheeler. Campbell killed over 50 people. He was convicted of murder exactly once in 1955 for $420. He spent 30 of his 71 years behind bars. Not for the 50-plus murders, for guns, for drugs, for being caught with the wrong things in the wrong car at the wrong time. Every witness who tried to put him away for what he actually did ended up dead, including one in the most protected facility the United States government could provide. Throat cut, X marks on his eyelids. The Italian Mafia, one of the most powerful crime organizations in American history, chose a black man from Detroit as their most trusted weapon. Not an employee, not a tool, a partner. A man they funded, protected, and needed. And the thing that scared everyone, cops, mobsters, prosecutors, judges, drug dealers, witnesses, wasn't the guns, it wasn't the body count, it was the notebooks. Because Chester Wheeler Campbell understood something that most criminals never grasp. Information is more dangerous than any weapon ever made. A bullet kills one person. A notebook with the right names, the right addresses, the right secrets, controls an entire city. He gathered intelligence the way a spy would: surveillance, payoffs, shadowing, contacts. He tracked everyone, and he wrote it all down. When they found those notebooks in the trunk of that Oldsmobile, 6 law enforcement agencies went to war with each other, not to bring Campbell to justice, but to control the information he had collected. Inside those pages were every dirty secret Detroit had been hiding for a decade. Those notebooks were the real weapon. That's the real story of Chester Wheeler Campbell. Not just a hitman, not just a killer. A man who turned knowledge into the most terrifying weapon in Detroit. The real John Wick did not exist in a movie. He drove a rented Oldsmobile through Orchard Lake, Michigan. The only thing that stopped him was not a rival gang, not the FBI, not the Italian Mafia. It was a narrow road and a patrol car coming the other direction. One near collision. That was all that separated Chester Wheeler Campbell from never being caught at all. 4 people, 4 answers. Look at what each one actually bought. Refusal cost her the business and changed nothing. The tribute flowed anyway, paid by other people for 30 years. Going around them worked right up until it did not. Because the thing about standing outside everyone's protection is that you are standing outside everyone's protection. Making yourself indispensable kept one man alive, funded another, and gave both a place inside organizations that would never once have called them equals. In the end, neither arrangement lasted forever. None of them beat it. That is the honest ending, and it is why this video is not called Outsmarted. What they did was find 4 different ways to survive a structure that none of them built and none of them could break. The structure outlasted all 4.